The faint scent of sandalwood clung to the air, a familiar comfort in old Mrs. Pay's residence. Sunlight, filtered through the silk curtains, painted elongated rectangles on the polished wooden floor. Outside, the chirping of unseen birds was a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere that permeated the room. Old Mrs. Pay traced the rim of her teacup, her gaze fixed on the delicate porcelain. Each swirl of the pale green tea leaves seemed to echo the swirling anxieties in her heart. Will he agree? After all these years, will he finally understand how desperate I am? Her grandson, Pei Jinheng, sat opposite her, a picture of unsettling stillness. His usually sharp, perceptive eyes held a dull sheen, the vibrant life that once pulsed through him now a flickering ember. "How's it going?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper, brittle with age and worry. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air, the question about the relentless illness that was slowly consuming him. She already knew the answer, but hope, however fragile, compelled her to ask. "It's still the same as before," Dr. Lin's voice echoed in her memory, the words a death knell disguised as a medical report. "It seems that we can only hire the Poseidon doctor, otherwise, there is really no other way to extend Jinheng's life." Poseidon. A name whispered in hushed tones, a figure shrouded in myth and rumor, a last resort for the desperate and the dying. Jinheng shifted slightly in his chair, the movement almost imperceptible, yet it spoke volumes of his discomfort. He took a slow sip of his tea, the delicate porcelain cup dwarfed in his large hand. Another pointless consultation, he thought, the bitter taste of resignation clinging to his palate. They chase shadows, grasping at straws, while 2M already prepared. "Grandma, don't embarrass the doctor," he said, his voice calm, almost detached. The words were meant to soothe her, to quell her tireless efforts, but they held a chilling finality. "I still have half a year to live." Half a year. The words echoed in the silence, a countdown to an inevitable end. Old Mrs. Pay's hand trembled, the teacup rattling against the saucer. "Half a year," she repeated silently, the thought a sharp, physical pain. How could she, who had watched him grow from a mischievous child into the formidable man he was, accept such a fate? Years of power and influence had hardened her, yet this was a battle she couldn't win. The lines etched on her face deepened, each one a testament to the sleepless nights and the silent pleas to a heaven that seemed deaf to her prayers. She observed him, her heart aching at his forced composure. He had always been stoic, even as a child, internalizing his emotions, carrying the weight of the world on his young shoulders. But this was different. It wasn't stoicism, it was acceptance. A chilling, quiet acceptance of his impending demise. "Jinheng," she began, her voice catching in her throat, each word a struggle. She hesitated, searching for the right approach, the right words to penetrate the wall he had built around himself. An idea, desperate and unconventional, sparked in her mind. Perhaps a wedding ceremony might help," she finally uttered, the words hanging in the air, fragile and uncertain. Jinheng's eyebrows furrowed slightly, a ripple of surprise disturbing the placid surface of his expression. "A wedding," he repeated, the word foreign and incongruous in the context of his illness. He searched her face, looking for a hint of jest, a flicker of the pragmatic woman he knew. But there was none. Only a desperate hope, shining in her aged eyes, clinging to the slimmest of chances. "Yes," old Mrs. Pay continued, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a resurgence of hope. "There's an old saying, you know, about joyous occasions warding off bad luck. It might just shift the balance." Her words were laced with a touch of superstition, a desperate grasp at anything that might offer a glimmer of hope. Jinheng remained silent, his gaze fixed on the swirling tea leaves in his cup. A wedding, he thought, the idea absurd, yet strangely compelling. He wasn't a superstitious man, but in the face of death, logic often took a back seat to hope. He pictured Su Yenran, her elegant figure, her calculated smile. He had agreed to the marriage as a strategic alliance, a move to solidify his position within the business world. Love had never been part of the equation. Now, facing his mortality, the prospect of a marriage, of a shared life, however brief, held a strange appeal. It was a flicker of warmth in the encroaching cold. A chance, however small, to experience something real before the final curtain fell. Who would agree to marry a dying man? He finally asked, the question a quiet admission of his own vulnerability, a crack in the stoic facade he had so carefully constructed. Old Mrs. Pei reached across the table, her wrinkled hand covering his. "The Su family," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "The Su family will understand." A complex mix of emotions flitted across her face: determination, calculation, and a hint of guilt. The Su family, with their ambitions and their social climbing, would see this as an opportunity, even in the face of his illness. They would cling to the prestige of being connected to the Pei family, even if it was a dying branch. Jinheng closed his eyes, the weight of his grandmother's expectations settling heavily upon him. He knew the unspoken truth behind her words. The Su family wouldn't be marrying him, they would be marrying the Pei name, the legacy, the power. He was merely a vessel, a conduit to their ambitions. A bitter smile touched his lips. Even in death, he was a pawn in the game of power and influence. The gentle clinking of teacups, the rustling of silk curtains, the distant hum of the city, the sounds of life swirled around him, a stark reminder of all he was about to lose. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting his grandmother's. "All right, Grandma," he said, his voice resigned, yet tinged with a flicker of something akin to hope. "Let's do it." The decision was made. A wedding. A gamble. A desperate attempt to cheat death, even if it was only for a little while. Sunlight, filtered through the sheer curtains, painted the Su family's opulent living room in hues of amber and gold. The air, thick with the cloying sweetness of lilies, held a tension that belied the serene setting. Mr. Su paced, the rhythmic click of his leather shoes a counterpoint to the frantic chirping of a caged songbird. Mrs. Su sat perched on the edge of a silk-covered sofa, her fingers nervously twisting a jade pendant. Su Yenran remained stubbornly silent, her gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, a mask of indifference carefully constructed over the storm brewing within. "Yenran," Mr. Su finally broke the silence, his voice tight with suppressed anxiety, "you understand the importance of this union. The Pei family is crumbling," Su Yenran finished, her voice brittle. She finally lifted her head, her eyes, sharp and calculating, meeting her father's. "No, I won't marry. There are rumors outside that Pei Jinheng, a cripple, is dying soon. What good is a dying man's fortune?" A flicker of fear crossed Mr. Su's face. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that Yenran would see the long-term benefits, the security and prestige that came with being the wife of the Pei family's head, even a dying one. He'd underestimated her pragmatism, her unwavering focus on self-preservation. "But the Pei family has a big business," he countered, his voice laced with a hint of desperation, "and we can't afford to offend it. This marriage has been arranged for years." Mrs. Su, ever the pragmatist, chimed in, her voice smooth as polished jade, "Yenran, think of the opportunities. Even if his health is failing, the connections, the resources, they would be invaluable. Your future would be secure." Inwardly, she winced at the thinly veiled truth. Jinheng's illness was no secret. It cast a long shadow over their carefully laid plans. Su Yenran scoffed, a delicate curl of her lip betraying her disdain. Security? She craved more than security, more than being a widow clinging to the remnants of a dying empire. She craved power, influence, a life bathed in the spotlight. A dying husband wouldn't offer that. "My future would be tied to a corpse," she retorted, her voice laced with ice. "I'd rather carve my own path, thank you very much." A heavy silence descended, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Mr. Sue rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Offending the Pei family was unthinkable. Their business, their very livelihood, depended on this alliance. He glanced at his wife, his eyes pleading for a solution. She, in turn, looked towards the closed door of a small, almost forgotten room at the end of the hallway. A flicker of an idea, desperate and unconventional, sparked in her eyes. "There's another option," she said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Sue looked at her, bewildered. "Another option? What are you talking about?" Mrs. Sue's gaze remained fixed on the distant door. "Shimo," she finally uttered, the name hanging in the air like a fragile butterfly. Yenron's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Shimo? What does she have to do with this?" The existence of her younger sister, a quiet, almost invisible presence in their household, was rarely acknowledged, let alone considered relevant to their meticulously planned lives. Shimo, with her simple clothes, her quiet demeanor, and her strange fascination with herbs and ancient remedies, was an anomaly in their world of social climbers and calculated ambitions. Mr. Sue, equally perplexed, echoed his daughter's question. "Shimo. But she's just," he trailed off, unable to find the appropriate words to describe the daughter they had conveniently forgotten. Mrs. Sue stood, a new resolve hardening her features. "She has a gift," she said, her voice gaining strength. "A gift that might just save us all." A mixture of curiosity and apprehension flickered in Yenron's eyes. A gift? What gift could this forgotten sister possibly possess that would be of any use in this situation? Mrs. Sue walked towards the closed door, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. She paused, her hand hovering over the ornate handle, a strange mix of hope and trepidation churning within her. She hadn't spoken to Shimo in months, hadn't even thought of her, except as a faint shadow flitting through the edges of their lives. But desperation, as it often did, brought forth unexpected solutions. She pushed the door open. The room was small and sparsely furnished, a stark contrast to the opulent grandeur of the rest of the house. The air was infused with the earthy scent of dried herbs and the faint sweetness of burning incense. Shimo sat by the window, bathed in the soft afternoon light, meticulously grinding herbs in a porcelain mortar. She didn't look up, seemingly oblivious to their presence. Her long, dark hair cascaded around her shoulders like a silken waterfall, framing a face that held a serene composure, a quiet strength that was both intriguing and unsettling. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Mrs. Sue's face. This quiet, unassuming girl, could she really be the answer to their prayers? Could she possess the power to mend what seemed irrevocably broken? The fate of their family, their carefully constructed world, rested on the shoulders of this forgotten daughter. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Shimo," she began, her voice softer now, almost hesitant, "we need to talk." Shimo finally looked up, her dark eyes, deep and unreadable, meeting her mother's. In their depths, a wisdom flickered, an ancient understanding that belied her youthful appearance. She didn't speak, merely waited, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words, with years of neglect and a desperate plea hanging heavy in the air. The afternoon sunlight painted the scene in a golden hue, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent testament to the secrets and unspoken truths that filled the room. The fate of the Pei family, the future of the Su family, the life of Pei Jinhun, all hung precariously in the balance, suspended in the quiet stillness of that sun-drenched afternoon. The last rays of the setting sun painted the mountain peaks in hues of orange and violet, casting long, dancing shadows across the winding path. Shimo, her simple cotton clothes clinging to her slight frame, stood at the edge of the village, her gaze fixed on the descending path. A small, worn medicine bag swung gently from her shoulder, a silent testament to her purpose. Her heart thrummed with a nervous energy. He was late. Again. A sigh escaped her lips, a puff of white against the cooling air. He promised he'd be back before dusk. The thought, tinged with both worry and a familiar exasperation, echoed in the quiet chambers of her mind. The mountain air, crisp and carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, filled her lungs. She inhaled deeply, trying to quell the disquiet that gnawed at her. It was foolish to worry, she told herself. He'd always returned, his weathered face bearing the marks of his journeys, his medicine bag invariably lighter than when he left. His failures, however, weighed heavier on him each time. She pictured him, a stooped figure against the vastness of the mountains, each step a testament to his unwavering, yet often futile, mission. A flicker of movement at the bend in the path caught her eye. Relief washed over her, quickly followed by a familiar twinge of disappointment. His shoulders slumped, his gait weary. The medicine bag, hanging limply at his side, confirmed her fears. Empty. Again. Master, she called out, her voice soft yet carrying in the stillness of the evening. He looked up, a flicker of recognition in his tired eyes. Momo is back, a voice, raspy with exhaustion, called from the path. It was old Manly, one of the village elders, his face etched with the wisdom of age and hardship. Hang the high, you are finally back. He paused, his gaze shifting to the empty medicine bag. A knowing look passed between them. How about this time when you go down the mountain to make money? It's not easy to make money. Tsushimo's heart ached at the old man's words. They were a constant refrain, a reminder of their precarious existence. They needed money, for food, for medicine, for the very roof over their heads. Yet, her master, a healer of unparalleled skill, possessed a peculiar aversion to accepting payment for his services. It was a principle, a stubborn idealism that clashed harshly with the realities of their life. Hang the high, her master, reached her side, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He leaned heavily on his walking stick, his aged face creased with fatigue. He offered her a weak smile. I brought you a message. His words, cryptic and unexpected, sparked a flicker of curiosity within her. Messages were rare in their isolated world. A message, she repeated, her voice laced with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. From whom? He placed a calloused hand on her shoulder, his grip surprisingly firm despite his apparent exhaustion. From the world below, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes, usually filled with a gentle warmth, now held a strange intensity. They need you, Shimo. A knot formed in her stomach. The world below was how he referred to the bustling cities and towns beyond their mountain sanctuary, places teeming with people and problems, a world she had deliberately chosen to leave behind. They need me, she echoed, her voice barely audible. She had sought refuge in these mountains, seeking solace and anonymity. The thought of returning to that world, of confronting its complexities and its demands, filled her with a deep unease. They need Poseidon, he corrected, his voice gaining strength, a strange glint in his eyes. Tsushimo's breath hitched. Poseidon. The name, whispered in hushed tones in the medical circles of the world below, was synonymous with miraculous healing, with impossible cures. It was a legend, a myth. And it was a name she had vowed never to use, a mantle she had sworn never to assume. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. Master, you know, her voice trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air between them. He knew her secret, the burden she carried, the gift she tried so desperately to conceal. He nodded, his expression unreadable. They need you, Shimo. They need Poseidon. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the distant, twinkling lights of the city below. And, he added, his voice barely a whisper, you need this. Tsushima remained silent, her mind racing. She understood his unspoken words. He wasn't just talking about the people who needed healing, he was talking about her, about the restless spirit that yearned to use her gifts, about the gnawing guilt she felt for hiding her abilities from a world that desperately needed them. She looked at her master, his face etched with fatigue and worry, a worry that mirrored her own. He needed her to succeed, not just for the sake of others, but for their own survival. The weight of his unspoken plea settled heavily upon her. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a dog. The mountain air, once a source of solace, now felt heavy, oppressive. The setting sun cast long shadows, stretching across the path, obscuring the way forward. Tsushima closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, the scent of pine and earth doing little to calm the turmoil within her. The world below awaited. And she, the reluctant healer, the hidden Poseidon, had a decision to make. The opulent Pei residence, bathed in the soft glow of evening lanterns, held a palpable tension. Silk drapes whispered against polished mahogany, but the air itself seemed to crackle with unspoken anxieties. Old Mrs. Pei sat rigid, her wrinkled hands clutching a jade pendant, her eyes fixed on the intricately carved doorway. News of the Su family's refusal had struck her like a physical blow. Yanran, that frivolous girl, how could she? Her thoughts were a whirlwind of disbelief and rising panic. Jinheng, her beloved grandson, his life hanging by a thread, and now this. The Su family's connection, their supposed loyalty, it had all been a facade. But Jinhengi doesn't have much time. A rustle of silk announced the arrival of the Su family's car. Hope, fragile yet insistent, flickered in old Mrs. Pei's chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, they had reconsidered. The heavy doors swung open, revealing not Su Yanran, the expected bride, but her younger sister, Su Shimo. Shimo, a quiet, almost invisible presence in the Su household, stood framed in the doorway, her plain dress a stark contrast to the lavish surroundings. Her eyes, though downcast, held a steady, unsettling calm. Su's father, his face etched with a nervous smile, cleared his throat. Old Mrs. Pei, 1,000 apologies for Yenran's indisposition. But Shimo, my younger daughter, insisted on paying her respects. His words felt hollow, laced with a desperation old Mrs. Pei recognized. They were clinging to the vestiges of this alliance, offering a substitute, a pale imitation of what they had promised. Respects. Old Mrs. Pei thought, bitterness twisting in her gut. They send this child as a peace offering while their favored daughter shuns my dying grandson. Aloud, her voice was brittle. And what respects can a young girl like yourself offer? Su Shimo raised her head, her gaze meeting old Mrs. Pei's directly. A flicker of something defiance. Determination. Passed through her eyes before vanishing behind a veil of polite deference. Grandmother Pei, she began, her voice soft yet surprisingly firm, I've heard about Jinheng's illness. Heard? The word echoed in the opulent room, laden with unspoken meaning. Old Mrs. Pei felt a prickle of unease. This girl, this quiet, unassuming girl, there was something different. Su's mother, ever eager to smooth over any wrinkles in their precarious social climb, rushed to interject. Shimo has always been interested in medicine. A childish hobby, of course. Her tone dismissed Shimo's words, attempting to steer the conversation back to safer waters. But old Mrs. Pei's attention was riveted on Shimo. Interested in medicine? A desperate thought, born of equal parts hope and cynicism, clawed at her. And what do you know of my grandson's illness? Su Shimo's gaze remained steady. I've heard the diagnoses. I've studied his symptoms. Su's father coughed nervously. Shimo, don't bother grandmother Pei with your, let her speak, old Mrs. Pei commanded, her voice sharp. The jade pendant in her hand felt suddenly warm, a spark of irrational hope igniting in her chest. You still dislike our Mr. Pei? Nonsense. Why should I marry him to be rich? Su Yenran's voice, shrill and laced with petulance, echoed from the hallway. She had apparently been eavesdropping, her words a cruel counterpoint to the tense silence in the room. Su's mother hissed, her face contorted with anger. Yenran. Behave yourself. Su Shimo's expression remained unchanged, but a flicker of something akin to sadness crossed her eyes. It was a fleeting glimpse into a world of hidden emotions, a world old Mrs. Pei suddenly found herself wanting to explore. Turning back to the older woman, Shimo spoke, her voice calm and clear amidst the swirling family drama. As long as it can save your life, you can try any method. She paused, her gaze unwavering. I can cure your disease. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Pei Jinheng, listening from the doorway of his room, felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in weeks, hope. He had resigned himself to his fate, accepting the slow, agonizing decline with a stoic indifference. But this girl, this unexpected presence, her quiet confidence resonated with a strange power. He watched her, his gaze sharp and assessing, as she faced down his family, their disbelief and suspicion palpable. Cure me. He thought, the words echoing in his mind. Could she truly possess such skill? He found himself wanting to believe, against all logic, against all the pronouncements of the esteemed doctors who had paraded through his room, their faces grim and their prognosis dire. There was something in Su Shimo's eyes, a quiet strength, an unwavering certainty that resonated with a deep, forgotten part of himself. The opulent chandelier cast a shimmering glow over the hushed auction hall, its crystal facets refracting the light onto the eager faces below. Su Shimo, seated beside her parents, felt a strange disconnect from the opulent surroundings. The hushed whispers, the rustle of silk, the clinking of champagne flutes, it was a world she rarely glimpsed, a world that belonged to Su Yenran. Yenran, however, was noticeably absent. Her absence, a stark contrast to her usual eagerness for such events, was a quiet testament to Pei Jinheng's deteriorating health. A marriage to a dying man holds little allure, Su Shimo thought wryly, tracing the rim of her untouched glass of water. She preferred the quiet murmur of the mountain stream near her master's secluded dwelling, the scent of pine and damp earth, to the cloying perfume and the undercurrent of avarice that hung heavy in the air. Her mother, however, was in her element. Her gaze darted across the room, assessing the attendees, their jewelry, their attire, with a calculating gleam in her eyes. Such wealth, she murmured, a sigh escaping her lips. Just imagine, Shimo, if Yenran marries into the Pei family, her voice trailed off, the unspoken implication hanging between them. Su Shimo remained silent. She knew her mother's dreams, the social elevation, the financial security. Dreams that now seemed precariously balanced on the fragile thread of Pei Jinheng's life. The auctioneer's voice, smooth and practiced, cut through the low hum of conversation. A Ming vase, its intricate blue and white design catching the light, was presented. Bids flew back and forth, escalating rapidly. Su Shimo found herself drawn in, despite her attempts to remain detached. Her master, Pang Dehai the elusive Poseidon, though the world didn't know it, had instilled in her not only medical knowledge, but also a deep appreciation for art and history. He'd say, understanding the past unlocks the secrets of the present. His words echoed in her mind as she observed the vase, a subtle flaw in the glaze barely visible to the untrained eye. A clever forgery, she concluded, her gaze drifting towards the bidder, a man whose face radiated smug satisfaction. 2 million, the man declared, his voice laced with triumph. Su Shimo's lips twitched. 2 million for a fake. The irony was almost palpable. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the entrance. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "It's Pei Ziyuan," someone hissed. Pei Ziyuan, Pei Jinheng's second uncle, entered the hall, his presence casting a pall over the proceedings. His smile was thin, his eyes sharp and calculating. Su Shimo felt a prickle of unease. There was something about the man, a veiled ruthlessness that she couldn't quite place. "I heard that the disciples of divine Dr. Poseidon will hold an auction tomorrow," a woman's voice drifted from a nearby table. "Maybe we can get some rare medicinal herbs." Su Shimo's heart skipped a beat. Poseidon. Her master's name, spoken in hushed tones, as if invoking a legend. She lowered her head, her fingers tightening around her glass. She couldn't afford to draw attention to herself. Not yet. "This is Huang Gongwang's dwelling in the Fuchin Mountains," the auctioneer announced, his voice rising with excitement. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The painting, a masterpiece of Chinese landscape art, was unveiled. Its serene beauty, its delicate brushstrokes, captivated the room. Su Shimo's breath caught in her throat. It was a forgery. A remarkably skillful one, but a forgery nonetheless. The subtle variations in ink tone, the minute discrepancies in the brushwork details invisible to the untrained, screamed their falsehood to her. Yet, the bidding began, escalating at a dizzying pace. Driven by greed, by the desire to possess a piece of history, the bidders ignored the subtle clues that betrayed the painting's true nature. Pei Ziyuan was among the most fervent bidders. His eyes, gleaming with avarice, were fixed on the painting. "He knows," Su Shimo realized, a chill running down her spine. He knew it was a fake. And he was bidding anyway. Why? The internal question burned. An idea, dangerous and audacious, began to form in Su Shimo's mind. She caught the auctioneer's eye, a slight nod conveying her intention. 5 million, she called out, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the frenzy. The room fell silent. All eyes turned towards her. Su Shimo met their gazes, her expression unreadable. Her mother gasped, her face a mixture of shock and bewilderment. Pei Ziyuan's gaze locked with hers, his eyes narrowing. He recognized her, she knew. Recognized the subtle signs, the quiet observation, the unwavering gaze that betrayed her knowledge. He knew who she was. Or rather, who her master was. He increased his bid. 6 million. Su Shimo calmly raised her bid. 7. The game continued. The price climbed higher and higher, fueled by Pei Ziyuan's inexplicable determination and Su Shimo's unwavering resolve. Finally, at 10 million, Pei Ziyuan stopped. The hammer fell. Su Shimo had won. A wave of murmurs washed over the room. Who was this unknown woman, this quiet observer who had just outbid one of the city's wealthiest men? Su Shimo's heart pounded in her chest. The gamble had paid off. But the real game, she knew, was just beginning. She had exposed Pei Ziyuan's willingness to pay exorbitant sums for a forgery, a clear indication of money laundering. And she had gained a substantial sum of money, money she would use to further her own plans, plans that involved ensuring Pei Jinheng's survival and uncovering the truth behind his illness. "I'll take Pei Jinheng back to the room for acupuncture first," Su Shimo murmured to her bewildered parents, her voice calm despite the turmoil within. She rose, a faint smile playing on her lips. The whispers followed her as she left, each one a testament to the shift in power, the subtle realignment of forces that had just taken place. The night, she knew, was far from over. The air in the Pei residence, usually thick with the scent of sandalwood and success, now held a brittle tension. The extravagant decor, the gleaming marble floors, the priceless antiques all seemed to mock the fragile peace that had settled after the auction. Pei Jinheng, propped up against a mountain of silk pillows, felt the familiar tremor in his legs subside. It wasn't a complete recovery, but the agonizing cramps that had gripped him for weeks were loosening their hold. He watched his grandmother, old Mrs. Pei, pace the length of the room, her face etched with a mixture of relief and suspicion. He knew her well enough to understand the calculations churning behind her worried gaze. His survival was not just a personal victory, it was a strategic advantage in the silent war being waged within the family. Better? Old Mrs. Pei finally stopped, her sharp eyes pinning him. Jinheng managed a small nod, his voice still raspy. Much better, grandmother. He didn't elaborate, letting the ambiguity hang in the air. He wanted to observe their reactions, to gauge the truth hidden beneath the veneer of familial concern. Su Yanran, perched on a delicate chair near the window, offered a strained smile. Her relief seemed performative. Jinheng's returning health complicated her carefully constructed escape route from this unwanted marriage. He could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, recalibrating her strategy. He found her predictable, almost boring. Her sister, Su Shimo, however, remained a quiet enigma. She stood slightly apart, her gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the carpet, as if the threads held the answers to the universe. It was she who had insisted on a second opinion after the auction, she who had diagnosed the poison. Su Shimo's quiet observation grated on Su Yanran's nerves. Yanran couldn't fathom her sister's apparent indifference. Jinheng's recovery meant the revival of the marriage proposal, a prospect Yanran found utterly repulsive. This illness had been her salvation, a convenient excuse to disentangle herself from the Pei family's sinking ship. Now, with Jinheng's unexpected recovery, she felt trapped once more. Your legs should be feeling better now, Su Shimo's voice, soft yet firm, cut through the strained silence. It's mostly poisoning. The room went still. Old Mrs. Pei's eyes narrowed, her gaze darting between Su Shimo and Jinheng. Poisoning. She echoed, the word hanging in the air like a venomous serpent. Jinheng met his grandmother's gaze, a flicker of understanding passing between them. I've suspected it for a while, he admitted, his voice gaining strength. The subtle shift in his demeanor, from invalid to strategist, was not lost on the others in the room. Su Yanran's parents exchanged uneasy glances. The implication of foul play within the Pei family was unsettling. Their ambitions, so closely tied to this alliance, now seemed precariously balanced on a knife's edge. I have every reason to suspect that he was the one who poisoned me, Jinheng continued, his gaze settling on the empty space where his second uncle, Pei Ziyuan, usually sat. His words were carefully chosen, each syllable a calculated move in the game he was now playing. The accusation hung heavy in the air, a palpable shift in the room's atmosphere. Su Shimo watched the interplay of emotions with detached curiosity, her mind dissecting the situation with clinical precision. She had fulfilled her obligation, her master's teachings compelled her to alleviate suffering. But the undercurrents of power and deceit swirling within the Pei family were a different kind of malady, one she wasn't equipped to cure. Old Mrs. Pei's face hardened, the lines around her mouth deepening. Ziyuan's ambition was no secret, his hunger for control a constant shadow looming over the family. But proof, that was another matter. Proof, Jinheng, she said, her voice a low growl. Accusations without proof are like whispers in the wind. Jinheng offered a faint smile, a glint of steel in his eyes. Patience, grandmother. I'll let him open his eyes, I want to see what other tricks he has. His words were laced with a chilling calm, a promise of retribution. Later that evening, as the moon cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the Pei estate, Jinheng found himself alone with Su Shimo in the library. The shelves, lined with leather-bound volumes, seemed to absorb the lingering tension. He watched her as she examined a rare medical text, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her quiet competence, her unwavering focus, intrigued him. She was a puzzle he was increasingly eager to solve. "You never sought recognition for your gift," he finally said, his voice a low murmur. "Why?" Tsushima looked up, her gaze steady, unreadable. "My master taught me that true healing lies in anonymity. The reward is in the act, not the acclaim." Her words resonated with a strange truth that surprised even him. In his world, everything had a price, every action a motive. Her selflessness was a foreign concept, a refreshing anomaly. He knew then, with a certainty that startled him, that she was different. She was the antidote to the poison that had seeped into his life, both literally and figuratively. The game had changed. It was no longer just about survival. It was about something more. He just didn't know what that more was yet. The uncertainty, for the first time in a long time, didn't frighten him. It intrigued him. The days that followed were a whirlwind of hushed meetings, covert investigations, and carefully orchestrated maneuvers. Jinheng, revitalized by Tsushima's treatment, took control of the situation with a ruthless efficiency that surprised even his closest advisors. He was a man reborn, fueled by a newfound purpose. He allowed Ziyuan to believe he was still weak, still vulnerable, watching as his uncle's greed and ambition pushed him to make increasingly reckless moves. The net was closing, and Jinheng was the spider, patiently waiting for his prey to stumble into the web. Tsushima, despite her initial reluctance, found herself drawn into the unfolding drama. She continued to treat Jinheng, her medical expertise proving invaluable in his recovery. But it was more than just medical attention that bound them. A strange, unspoken connection had formed between them, a silent understanding that transcended words. He saw past her quiet exterior, recognizing the strength and intelligence that lay hidden beneath. And she, in turn, saw the vulnerability beneath his carefully constructed facade of power. The confrontation with Ziyuan was inevitable. It came during a tense family meeting, the air thick with suspicion and unspoken accusations. Jinheng, no longer feigning weakness, laid out his evidence with cold precision, exposing Ziyuan's treachery for all to see. The shock and outrage were palpable, the carefully maintained facade of family unity shattering into a million pieces. Ziyuan's face, usually so composed, contorted with rage and disbelief. He denied everything, of course, but his denials rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. He had underestimated Jinheng, underestimated the quiet strength of the woman who had saved his life. As Ziyuan was escorted away, his dreams of power and control dissolving into dust, Jinheng turned to Tsushima. Their eyes met, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had won together. The future stretched before them, uncertain yet full of possibilities. The poison was gone, but the scars remained. And in those scars, a new kind of strength was growing. The opulent chandelier cast long shadows across the polished marble floor, each tick of the grandfather clock echoing the heavy silence that had descended upon the Pei residence. Old Mrs. Pei sat rigidly, her face etched with an exhaustion that ran deeper than mere fatigue. She clutched her prayer beads, the jade cool against her trembling fingers. Jinheng, my Jinheng. The thought reverberated through her mind, a constant, dull ache. The news had spread through the house like wildfire. Ziyuan, her own son, had been taken away. Arrested. The word itself felt alien in this house, a place of hushed whispers and veiled truths. But he tried to kill Jinheng. Poison. A wave of nausea rose in her throat. She had misjudged, trusted, been utterly blind. Across the city, in the more modest, but no less tense Su residence, Mr. and Mrs. Su stared at their youngest daughter with a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension. Shimo, their quiet, unassuming Shimo, stood before them, the flickering lamplight revealing a strength in her eyes they had never seen before. It's just a false name. I deliberately lied to you by pretending to be poor all those years. Her voice, though soft, carried an undeniable weight. Mrs. Sue's carefully constructed composure crumbled. She reached out, her hand hovering over Shimo's arm before falling back to her side. Lied? But why all those years of hardship? She couldn't finish the sentence, the implication too painful. My own daughter deceiving us? Mr. Sue, ever the pragmatist, recovered more quickly. Shimo, he began, his voice cautious, if you are indeed associated with Dr. Poseidon, he trailed off, his mind already calculating the potential implications of this revelation. Back at the Pei residence, a knock on the door shattered the oppressive silence. Vice President Chen, his face pale and drawn, stood on the threshold. Vice President Chen, why are you here? Old Mrs. Pei asked, her voice hoarse. Chen hesitated, his gaze shifting towards the closed door of Pei Jinheng's room. Madam Pei, he began, his voice low, I have news. Regarding Dr. Poseidon. The old woman's frail body straightened. Poseidon? Have you found him? Hope flickered in her eyes, fragile but fierce. Chen cleared his throat. Dr. Poseidon will arrive in Kyoto in the near future. He has already been contacted. He couldn't bring himself to reveal the full truth just yet. He couldn't bring himself to say that the legendary doctor wasn't arriving, but was already here, tending to her grandson. This young woman Su Shimo, the rumors were true. The apprentice who surpassed even the master. He thought, remembering the impossible recovery he had witnessed. Inside Jinheng's room, bathed in the soft glow of a bedside lamp, Su Shimo packed her medical kit. Her movements were precise, economical, each item placed with deliberate care. Jinheng watched her, a strange mixture of gratitude and curiosity swirling within him. He had been hovering between life and death, resigned to his fate, yet this quiet, unassuming woman had pulled him back. She's different from anyone I've ever met. The thought resonated within him, a quiet hum against the backdrop of his physical weakness. He had seen the fear in Yenron's eyes, the calculated concern of his relatives, but in Shimo's gaze, he saw only focus. An unwavering dedication to her craft. You're leaving? He asked, his voice a low rasp. Shimo paused, her hand resting on the closed kit. Yes, she replied, her voice soft but firm. You're stable now. There's nothing more I can do. Nothing more she can do. He thought, a flicker of anxiety igniting within him. It wasn't just his physical health, he felt drawn to her, to the quiet strength she exuded. He wanted to know more, to understand the enigma that was Su Shimo. He wanted what do I want? The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but palpable. Su Shimo met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Her heart was a battlefield. The years of training, the strictures imposed by her master, the weight of her secret identity, it all pressed down on her. I should leave. I shouldn't get involved. But something held her back. A flicker of concern, a sense of unfinished business. And perhaps, a sliver of something more. She thought of her family, of the lies she had lived, of the sacrifices she had made. It's time, she realized, time to face the consequences. As the night wore on, the truth unraveled, weaving its way through the interconnected lives of the Pei and Su families. The police investigation, spurred by Shimo's anonymous tip, had uncovered Pei Ziyuan's elaborate scheme. The poisoned tea, the forged documents, the carefully orchestrated accidents, it all pointed to a desperate bid for power, a ruthless ambition that had almost cost Pei Jinheng his life. Within the Su family home, the initial shock gave way to a torrent of emotions. Mrs. Su's tears flowed freely, a mixture of relief and regret. Mr. Su, ever pragmatic, began to assess the situation. The alliance with the Pei family, once seemingly secure, now teetered on the brink of collapse. But Shimo, he thought, she's the key. The legendary doctor's apprentice. This could change everything. At the Pei residence, old Mrs. Pei finally learned the truth. Su Shimo, the quiet, unassuming young woman, was the one who had saved her grandson's life. Not some distant, mythical figure, but someone who had been right there all along. The revelation brought a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. She looked at Shimo, a genuine warmth radiating from her aged eyes. This girl, she's a blessing. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, a new chapter began. The secrets had been revealed, the betrayals exposed, the balances of power shifted. Pei Jinheng, recovering steadily, found himself drawn to Su Shimo with an intensity he couldn't deny. And Su Shimo, freed from the burden of her secrets, began to confront the complexities of her own heart. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility. The storm had passed, leaving behind the promise of a new beginning. Sunlight, hesitant at first, began to paint the edges of the curtains a soft gold. Pei Jinheng watched the shifting light, a subtle warmth spreading through him that mirrored the strange, unfamiliar lightness in his chest. Just a week ago, he'd been resigned to the encroaching darkness, accepting the cold grip of death. Now, he watched the dawn, feeling the steady beat of his own heart, a testament to Su Shimo's skill, her quiet strength. He'd never believed in miracles, but she was something beyond explanation. He turned his head slightly, his gaze resting on her sleeping form curled up in the armchair by his bedside. A faint crease furrowed her brow, a whisper of some unspoken concern playing on her lips. He'd misunderstood her, misjudged her. He'd seen only a quiet, unassuming woman, a convenient pawn in the machinations of his family and hers. He hadn't seen the fire within, the fierce loyalty, the exceptional skill that had not only saved his life, but had also, unknowingly, exposed the rot within his own family. The revelation of Pei Ziyuan's treachery had sent a chill through him, deeper even than the poison that had ravaged his body. He'd trusted his uncle, relied on him, and all the while, the man had been plotting his demise. The thought left a bitter taste in his mouth. Su Shimo stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. For a moment, her gaze was unfocused, lost in a hazy realm between sleep and wakefulness. Then, her eyes met his, a flicker of surprise quickly replaced by a quiet concern. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice soft, a balm to his frayed nerves. He wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, to reassure her, but a strange hesitation held him back. "Better," he managed, the word a pale imitation of the gratitude that swelled within him. "Much better." He watched as she rose from the chair, her movements graceful despite the cramped space. The morning light illuminated the subtle curve of her cheek, the delicate slope of her nose, the way her hair framed her face like a dark halo. He found himself captivated by the simple elegance of her presence. "You should rest," she said, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his heart quicken. "You've been through a lot." He knew she wasn't just talking about his illness. They'd both been through a lot. The unspoken tension hung heavy in the air between them, a tangled web of misunderstandings and unspoken truths. He cleared his throat, the words catching in his throat. "Shimo," he began, his voice rough, I owe you an apology." Her expression didn't change, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a guardedness that made his chest ache. "There's no need," she replied, her voice even. "I did what I had to do." He shook his head, the gesture sharp. "No," he insisted, "I misjudged you." I thought," he trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of his misunderstanding, the shame that gnawed at him. A faint sigh escaped her lips. "I understand," she said, her gaze drifting towards the window. "You weren't the only one." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He knew she was referring to her family, to their eagerness to push her sister into his arms, their blindness to her own worth. He understood their motivations, the lure of wealth and power, the desire to secure their future. But he also saw the subtle wounds they had inflicted, the quiet strength she possessed in the face of their indifference. "I will never believe it again in the future," he said, the words pouring out of him, driven by a need to reassure her, to bridge the chasm that separated them. "I will unconditionally believe whatever you say in the future." She turned back to him, her eyes searching his. He saw a flicker of surprise, a hint of vulnerability that made his breath catch in his throat. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he could try to build a future based on trust and understanding. I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. He saw the conflict warring within her, the hesitation that held her captive. He reached out then, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through him, a spark of connection that ignited something deep within his soul. "Shimo," he said, his voice low, his gaze locked on hers, "I feel like I've fallen in love with you." The confession hung in the air, fragile yet potent. He saw the shock ripple through her, the widening of her eyes, the slight parting of her lips. He held his breath, waiting for her response, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he was taking a risk, laying bare his emotions, but he also knew he couldn't keep them buried any longer. He'd faced death, stared into the abyss, and emerged with a newfound clarity, a desperate need for something real, something true. And that truth, he realized, was her.